everyone, and welcome to the Dawn Farm Education Series. I'm Brad Schmidt, co-coordinator of the Dawn Farm Education Series. Tonight's program, Spirituality and Recovery, The Many Paths to Spiritual Fitness, will be presented by Jerry Fouchey. Jerry Fouchey has extensive experience in the field of education as an administrator, facilitator, strategist, teacher, and practitioner in the areas of educational administration, curriculum instruction, and staff development, and has played leadership roles for many initiatives in various public school districts. After several years as a Dawn Farm Sp.A Recovery Center counselor and later as an outpatient therapist, Jerry Fouchey currently serves as a lifestyle medicine therapist and a didactic group facilitator for Dawn Farm. Jerry was instrumental in the implementation of Dawn Farm's dialectical behavior therapy and lifestyle medicine programs. So please join me tonight in welcoming Jerry Fouchey for a presentation.
Okay. Good evening.
Good evening.
Are we wired? Okay, oh, there. Okay, the sound is working. Okay. So I'm so grateful to be here. I'm so grateful that you all made the decision to be here tonight as well. This whole spirituality and recovery thing has been a personal quest of mine for some time, being a person in recovery myself. But in addition to that, I've worked at the farm in a variety of roles over time, and I've noticed that a great deal of clients, when they first come to us in early recovery, really wrestle with this issue of spirituality, like what's it all about? And my hope tonight is what we're going to be able to do is sort of walk through the various questions that people really wrestle with in those places in a variety of ways. As we begin to explore this notion of spirituality and recovery, it's important to note that the goal of spirituality and mutual aid groups like AA and NA is to achieve and maintain an effective lifestyle free of alcohol and drugs. Like, that's why we get spiritual, because we want to stay clean and sober. Similarly, other 12-step programs have developed which are designed to address compulsive behaviors like codependence, gambling, eating disorders, sexually acting out, or whatever the compulsion. There is likely a 12-step program designed to address it. But the common thread that ties all these fellowships together is their belief in the need for a higher power, or as a God as you understand him, and some kind of spiritual practice as a means to access that power. After all, the book of Alcoholics Anonymous, informally referred to as the Big Book, reminds us that lack of power is our dilemma. This is in sharp contrast to the non-spiritual recovery programs such as Rational Recovery, Smart Recovery, Women for Sobriety, Secular Organizations for Sobriety, Life Bringer Moderation Management, all of which are programs that have reported some success supporting people in recovery, but they all explicitly define themselves different from 12-step programs in that they are secular rather than spiritual. In 12-step recovery, we come to this power reveal something called a spiritual experience or spiritual awakening, and as we pursue a program of recovery, we work to effectively access a higher power that we can provide daily reprieve from compulsive behaviors that promotes a state known as fit spiritual condition that supports our long-term sobriety, clean time, and a rewarding life. Now, that's a whole big long paragraph as a way of introduction, and it has a lot of key ideas in there that we're going to need to break apart as we go through this. Well, when people get to recovery, they get stumbling over this thing called spiritual stuff, okay? Basically, Bill laid it out in the Big Book for us really clearly. He said, you know, we've got this lack of power dilemma. You've got to find some power someplace. And so they started to define this notion of a power greater than themselves. Now, many people, as soon as they heard this, God as you understand him, they right away sort of made this shift to thinking about supreme being of the universe, kind of traditional religious ideas. Now, for atheists and agnostics, that's a hard pill to swallow. It's like they don't even want to talk about that. And so you have to say, well, no, that isn't really what Bill and Bob had in mind when they started to develop these things. And so they said, what we really want you to do is think about a higher power, one that makes sense to you. What we want you to be able to do is begin to develop a relationship with that power and figure out how to access it so that you can stay clean and sober. Because clean and sober, what it's all about. If you're not clean and sober, you got nothing going on. Okay, that's the key piece. Well, how do you get there? Well, that's part of the challenge, part of the question we want to try to wrestle with tonight, because we talked about these many paths that people are taking to get there. But the other piece we want to get next to is the fact that Bill defines it in the course of some of the program literature in both the AA Big Book and the 12 and 12, starts to define it in terms of some specific terms. He talks about a spiritual awakening or a spiritual experience. And right away, people start getting pictures in their minds of movies from the 50s, you know, where the clouds would part and the angels would come down and stuff would start to happen. And what he realized was eventually that isn't what happens for most people. For most people, it's a gradual thing. It's something they come into slowly. As a matter of fact, they're not even sure when it happened, but they can look back and say it has happened. Perhaps even more importantly is that people around you will realize it has happened before you realize it has happened. Bill talks about that in the second appendix to the big book, where he talks about this notion that frequently other people will notice it before we do. So let me give you a specific example. Okay? When I was working as a detox counselor a couple years back, it was not unusual for a person to come in very distressed state, emotionally, physically, financially, spiritually, legally. All those things are going on for them. It's an absolute mess. And so for the first couple of days, we're focused on taking their blood pressure and getting them some kind of rest and minding them if they're sick and getting them to the doctor if we need to. We're just doing all those sorts of things. And it's all very chaotic. And sometimes the response we get is very negative. It's very intense because I'm separating from one of the most significant relationships in my life, my drug of choice. And even though I know it's the right thing to do, it hurts like hell. And so we're getting some really nasty stuff coming back sometimes. Not always. I don't want to make it sound like I'm being critical of detox clients. I think some of them are here tonight, perhaps. But it was not unusual for people to have really aversive stuff at that point in their recovery. And yet I would get to know these folks, and so that they would move on to residential treatment, or they would move on to transitional housing, and they would start to come back to detox, and they would volunteer. They would do things like lead the evening meditation, or they would cook a meal, or they would sit with clients during one of the DBT groups. And what would start to happen is you realize that this person had begun to change, and things had started to happen. And then the real shift starts to happen when you see them take a real interest in somebody other than themselves. And you start talking to people and you realize, this is not the same person I met 3 or 4 months ago. Things are different. And you start to say that to them and they go, what do you mean? I don't think it's different. But it is. It's profoundly different. And so that's the piece we want to try to understand deeply tonight, is this notion of how do we understand a higher power? Because if I got 60 people in the room, I get 60 different understandings of a higher power, and that's perfectly good. The key piece is, if you are in recovery, have you got a power that's keeping you clean and sober? Have you got a power that's setting you on a path to a quality life? And that's the key. We also want to explore the power. How do you get there? How do you maintain that relationship? Those are the kind of key ideas we want to work our way through tonight. So as we start to talk about our objectives, we want to give you some historical framework for where this whole spirituality thing came from. We want to explore a variety of ways people in recovery come to understand a higher power, because there's a great many ways. Look at the concepts of spiritual experience, spiritual awakening, and spiritual fitness as discovered in the literature. Because the notion is spiritual fitness is when I'm in a good spot. The thought of a relapse is just not going to be there. It's just not probable. I'm spiritually fit. I'm doing what I need to do. So we understand that pretty clearly. We also want to consider the relationship between religion and spirituality, how these concepts are distinguished and yet related to each other. I want to describe some of the options for developing spiritual fitness, like how you're going to get there. And last but not least, we want to explore some applications of the 11th Step. If you're not familiar with the 11th Step, it's all about sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. Now, it sounds terribly religious until you start getting a recovery program understanding of a higher power. Now, as we start to move through all that, I'm going to ask you to... Oops, back up. There we go. Thank you. I'm going to ask you to participate tonight with an open mind. I've done this presentation in the past, and I've had some folks come up with sort of very specific opinions that they wanted either confirmed or denied, or they want to argue with me. And if you want to argue, we'll argue afterwards. I don't want to argue during the presentation. What I know is that some people come here and they say that recovery spirituality is really deeply rooted in a specific religious faith, and that we need to ignore anything in AA literature or history that suggests otherwise. And there are those who are atheist or agnostic and cause themselves to generate aversive responses to any discussion of a higher power. But Bill reminds us in the 12 and 12, the principle of all scientific progress is search and research, always with the open mind. So I invite you to come tonight with an open mind. I'm going to make a lot of references to AA and NA literature tonight. And if I do that and you find that your drug of choice or your compulsion doesn't seem fully represented there, I just want to encourage you to think about the notion that the concepts of recovery initially developed in AA and adopted by the other 12-step groups, I understand there's about 55 different 12-step groups now out there, and have grown from that base. And the AA experience applies to compulsions far beyond alcohol alone. And compulsive behaviors and drugs of various kinds were certainly not foreign concepts to the founders of AA. You got to read those stories sometimes. You know, Bill talks about washing down the sedative with the gin. You know, he was right there. Now, in order to show that newcomers can clearly identify, AA appropriately encourages focus on alcohol and NA on addiction to drugs. But in the long run, many find that these concepts of recovery are very much the same regardless of the addiction or the compulsion. So to sort of set a framework for this evening, Ernie Kurtz, an author you may have some familiar with. Ernie lived here in town. He only died a couple of years ago. He wrote a lot of interesting studies around recovery. And he and Bill White published an article, and he talked about the history of AA. And he said over time, the range of experience here ranged from those who were initially called the Christianizers within AA. Those are people that harbored no room for disagreement about a very explicit Christian content. I mean, that included things like, you know, we want to Christianize our early history. We want to elevate Christian literature on a par with AA's literature. We want to assert Christian conversion as central to the mechanism of AA's effectiveness. And on the other end are the secularizers, or people whose focus on steadily increasing number of people who begin to look at recovery but have no religious affiliation or interest. Many who tried AA found it too religious for their comfort. And so then you see the secularizers emerging, who are people of an atheist or agnostic AA groups. And there are atheist and agnostic AA groups who said, we don't believe in God, but we know there's some power greater than ourselves. And so they distinguish that with great clarity. But we generally direct their 12-step efforts at this population, those having no religion, seeking to make AA safe for atheists. And then after enunciating these two extremes of spiritual practice in AA, you know, Bill White and Ernie Kurtz went on to say that, you know, in our view, the two opposite responses within AA will probably continue into the foreseeable future. And I'm hitting the wrong buttons again. There we go. Probably continue into the foreseeable future. The great majority of AA members will more than likely continue to settle somewhere comfortably in between, more often than likely seeking out groups that better fit their middling inclinations. And so this dissonance in the early development of AA is reflected in the development of the Big Book itself. You know, Bill tells us, you see, you know, when the Big Book was being planned, some members thought that it ought to be Christian in its doctrinal sense. Others had no objection to the use of the word God, but wanted to avoid doctrinal issues. Spirituality, yes. Religion, no. Still others wanted a psychological book to sort of lure the alcoholics in. Every voice was playing its appointed part. Our atheists, and this is Bill talking now, he says, our atheists and agnostics widened our gateway so that all who suffer might pass through regardless of their belief or lack of belief. I think it was pretty profound of Bill to recognize that at that point in time, because we're talking about the early to the mid-30s. Later, almost as an aside, Kurtz and White point out the large part of the reason for this broad range of approaches to spirituality stems from the fact that AA is so decentralized that it's like there's really no such single entity called Alcoholics Anonymous. There's AA members, there's AA groups, that reflect this broad and ever-increasing variety of experience. So we want to be mindful that it keeps shifting. On a visit to Ann Arbor, recovery advocate Kevin McCauley, who developed the videos Pleasure Unwoven and Memo to Self, many of you may have seen those, they're around, we use them a lot, noted that he says, you know, if you're going to be in a program of recovery, you really don't have to find God. He says, but you do have to look. I always thought that was kind of a concise way of putting it. Sometimes people in early recovery have difficulty distinguishing spirituality from religion. And consequently, when AA or NA talk about a higher power, newcomers often tend to equate this term with the religious notion of a supreme being of the universe, which can be particularly problematic for atheists and agnostics. But as we start to think about this notion of distinguishing the two, in the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous, the co-founders, Bill and Bob, and you know, Bill was kind of if you haven't done much of the history yet, Bill was kind of a carnival huckster. He was out there, whatever it was, he was ready to sell it and make a big deal out of it. And Bob Smith was quite the contrast. He was sort of a straight-laced religious guy, sort of more quiet, more reserved, and yet they made this wonderful partnership. But they were looking for a way to illustrate this new spiritual practice promoting sobriety. And they'd been active in the Oxford movement, which was a spiritual reform initiative in the Anglican Church that they'd modified for their purposes. This new movement would welcome people of all backgrounds and beliefs, or none at all, with this distinct spirituality. By using the term higher power, the founders of AA worked to generate a clear distinction between AA and other existing religious groups. People came to AA to get sober, acknowledging a God of their understanding, and no one in AA would try to impose their personal religious ideas on anyone else. Newcomers found and continue to find that attitude welcoming. As Bill wrote in the big book, he says, much to our relief, we discovered we didn't need to consider somebody else's conception of God. Our own, however inadequate, was sufficient. To us, the realm of the Spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding to those that earnestly seek. It's open, we believe, to all men and women, by the way. You have to understand, Bill is a product of his time, so he uses male-dominant language all the time. Many modern folks find that somewhat aversive. But I always say, but when we're reading the Bible, when we're reading Shakespeare, we have to think about it's a product of his history as well. And we excuse those sort of quirks of language. And that doesn't mean that people today ought to continue to use that. But at least if you recognize it in its context, it starts to make more sense. So NA and A primarily define themselves as spiritual organizations. They do a lousy job of religion because, number one, they don't have any set beliefs or procedures or holy days or things like that religions have. Spirituality, on the other hand, is characterized by individuals pursuing a relationship with a power greater than themselves in order to improve their lives, and in the case of recovery, stay clean and sober. Their understanding of a higher power can be really personal and unique. People in recovery often identify themselves as spiritual, but not religious. I want to try to get a handle on what that means. Similarly, there are many people in recovery who are both spiritual and religious, with Buddhists, Christians, Hindus, Jews, Muslims, and adherents of any other faith getting clean and sober in AA and NA. Bill noted, he said, those having religious affiliations will find nothing disturbing to their beliefs or ceremonies here. There's no friction among us on those things. An Ed Series presentation a few years ago discussed the global growth and development of NA and noted that the country with the fastest growing Narcotics Anonymous membership in recent years is the Republic of Iran. Surprise to me, but this is a nation which is overtly religious. It is a theocracy, and yet its recovering citizens find no quarrel with the spirituality of NA. It is, however, important to note that our participation in meetings of recovery fellowships is characterized by expressing the spiritual aspects of our experience instead of the religious. Effective AA and NA groups and 12-step people generally neither advance nor diminish religion. Some members are strongly religious, others are strongly anti-religious. But Bill wrote, he said, we're only operating a spiritual kindergarten. I love that image. You see all these new AA people coming in, it's like they're kids in kindergarten, okay, in which people are unable to get over drinking and find the grace to go on living to better effect. Each man's theology has his, her, or their own quest. It's their own affair. So defining the difference between spiritual and religious really creates three groups of people. Now first, there are those who are spiritual and not religious. These are people pursuing a relationship with a higher power, but they've got no affiliation with any kind of house of worship. And then we have those folks who are spiritual and religious, pursuing a relationship with a higher power and active in an established community of faith. And finally, we have those who are religious and not spiritual. Now, that may sound like a bit of a conundrum there, but there are people who are active in an established religion. Maybe they're there for social or cultural reasons, but they're not pursuing a relationship with a higher power. And those folks are going to have trouble getting sober because they're going to have that lack of power dilemma. And that's the piece that we want to be mindful of. An important starting place as people begin to embrace 12-step recovery and to work to develop their understanding of a higher power or God is to consider page 62 in the big book where Bill challenges us by saying, first of all, we had to quit playing God. Now, it didn't work. Addicts and alcoholics often bristle at the suggestion that they have played God, but careful inventory usually reveals that they have played God by using drugs and alcohol to control the way they feel and by manipulating those around them to get what they wanted. The self-centered attitude endemic to addiction often nurtures the addict's delusion, see if you've ever entertained this one, that the addict, the alcoholic, is really the only one who knows the right way to do things, and they know exactly how the world should turn. When we are lost in our addiction, that is all we can think of. It ought to happen my way. This is the way it ought to go. And when newcomers begin to realize that while they were in their active addiction, that they generated a painful series of failed attempts at playing God, their need for a higher power which is separate from themselves becomes more clearly enunciated. I go back to Ernie Kurtz again, the guy we spoke about earlier, delineated this concept in his doctoral dissertation called Not God. And he said the fundamental message of Alcoholics Anonymous to its members is that they're not infinite, they're not absolute, they're not God. Every alcoholic's problem had first been claiming godlike powers, especially that of control. But the alcoholic is not in control, even of himself. And the first step towards recovery from alcoholism must be the admission and acceptance of this fact that is so blatantly obvious to others, but so tenaciously denied by the obsessive compulsive drinker. You know, and then he goes on, he says, you know, because the alcoholic's not God, not absolute, not infinite, he or she or they is essentially limited. And yet from this very limitation arises the beginning of healing and wholeness. It is this fact, this message of not God, that Alcoholics Anonymous as a fellowship lives out. To be an alcoholic within Alcoholics Anonymous is not only to accept oneself as not God, it implies also affirmation of one's connectedness to other people. Now, that may sound a little bit out there. People talk about, I don't really play God, what do you mean? But I could still remember my own experience. I had a job where I drove to work for a distance for a while. And my constant internal dialogue while I was there was, if they would quit, if they would only do it this way, if the weather would only go like this, it was just this non-stop process of trying to direct the world, according to Jerry. It didn't work. All they do is frustrate me and make me thirstier. So I just need to kind of go there with that. Yeah, let that one stick to you a minute. It might be helpful at this point to discuss some of the counterproductive ideas that people have early in recovery in their search for a God of their understanding. There are some conceptualizations of a higher power that don't give you the needed power to get sober. For example, on page 45 of the book, Bill says, you know, to others this word God brought up a particular idea of him with which somebody had tried to impress them during childhood. So feature this. Kids, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you know, mom or dad or grandma or grandpa, or somebody takes them and takes them to some house of worship and starts to teach them about spiritual things, starts to teach them about God things. And then as they grow up and mature, you find that they start backing up from some of that stuff. As an addiction develops, we tend to be very distant from that for the most part. And then at 25, 30 years old, you decide you want to get sober, and somebody says, what you need is a power greater than yourself. You need a God. And they go, wait. Now I lay me down to sleep, I play the Lord my soul. That's all I can think about is that 10-year-old relationship with God. I don't have any adult ideas about God. And so consequently, I rejected that particular notion because it was completely inadequate. And with that rejection, I thought I'd abandoned the God idea entirely. So part of what has to happen is when people come to recovery, they really have to come back and ask, like, whoa, where am I? What is really my understanding of a higher power? And have I given it a fair adult look? Or am I still swimming around in the ideas I had as a child? It's an important conversation. But there's a number of other ideas about a higher power that don't work in the business of staying sober. Some people have been distracted by what I call the vampire God. That's kind of an informal term. I haven't copyrighted it yet, but that's the God who sucks all the fun out of life. Now, I don't know about you, but most of the alcoholics and addicts I know require some fun in their lives, frequently more than average amount of fun. Others have believed in what I call the assassin God. Okay, it goes like this. This is the God who swiftly punishes those who have committed some offense with a tragedy or hardship of one kind or another. It might sound like, well, so the reason I got into the car accident this week was I lied about being sick at work last week. To which I want to respond, are you a dog that peed on the rug and you need to get smacked? Is that what you're telling me? Is that the relationship with that kind of power something which is going to lead you to be clean and sober and live a happy life? So some of those ideas need to be abandoned. In their search for a higher power, some have spent time worshiping at other altars. There'll be the altar of money, power, influence, sex, relationship, or work. But by honestly admitting that they needed to search for a higher power, they're also admitting that they're not God themselves. So it's only when you say, I'm really going to look at this thing and try to figure it out, that you've gotten to the place of setting aside that notion of being God. Staying clean and sober requires addicts and alcoholics to find a higher power that will supplant the power that alcohol and drugs had over them. So, like, how do you find a higher power? Well, Bill had an answer for that. He said, well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problem. I also want you to know the way Bill worded that last sentence. He said, find a power greater than yourself that will solve your problem, not that will help you solve your problem. but it's about getting involved with the power that will take care of the problem for you. And that's an important piece, because many of us have sort of this, I'm going to work my way to my own salvation thing. I'm going to figure out how to do this sober thing. I'm going to get the right amount of pieces and do it. And it's like, well, maybe. But have you found something bigger than yourself, or are you still trying to play God and direct the process? Kind of key questions. In working to understand a higher power, many find it helpful to begin on a simpler level by realizing how many higher powers there are in our lives. For example, while in active addiction, many allowed alcohol and drugs to become their higher power because we slavishly allowed these substances to make significant decisions for us. Decisions about how we're going to spend our money, where we're going to go, who we're going to spend our time with. We let the drug and alcohol make those decisions for us all the time. Similarly, the police department is a higher power, because if we run afoul of the law, we're going to have the bracelets on and be in the back seat of the squad car and have very little to say about it. Anybody? Oh, I won't shake anybody out, but my suspicion is that is not a foreign experience to some folks in the room. And if my car breaks down, my auto mechanic is a higher power because he can do something for me I can't do for myself. There are lots and lots of higher powers out there, question, but none of those higher powers are going to get me clean and sober. See, that's the part I got to realize. If I'm still focusing on supreme being of the universe, God thing, and I can't deal with that, your head's in the wrong place. I want to bring you back to, there are lots of things bigger than you. You need something bigger than you to help you think about this process of getting clean and sober. Once atheists and agnostics begin to understand that the focus of spirituality in 12-step groups is merely finding a power greater than themselves to solve the problem, it gets easier to embrace. So of all the higher powers people can find in their lives, which one is going to be effective at keeping them clean and sober? Many newcomers choose to think of their AA or NA group itself as their higher power. You know, Bill wrote in the 12 and 12, he said, you know, you can, if you wish, make AA itself your higher power. There's a very large group of people who've solved an alcohol problem. And in this respect, they are certainly power greater than you, who have never even come close to that solution. Surely you can have faith in them. You know, and someone who's active in AA can tell you, it's like, well, you know, I'm not always sure about what this higher power thing's about. But what I know is when I get together with this group of people 3 or 4 times a week, I don't need to take a drink, and I can't do that by myself. So that's greater than me. You see where I'm going here, friends? I'm trying to open the door wide, because that's what those early founding fathers knew was necessary. After interviewing AA's co-founder Bill Wilson, author Robert Thompson provided a description of a 1930s Tuesday evening AA meeting in Bill's home. He says, you know, in my home there were agnostics in the Tuesday night group and several hardcore atheists who objected any mention of God. These men believed in each other and in the strength of the group. And at some time, each of them had been totally unable to stop drinking on his own. Yet, when 2 of them had worked at it together, somehow they became more powerful. And they had finally been able to stop. This then, whatever it was that occurred between them, was what could accept as a power greater than themselves. And I really want you to think about that preposition between, because we're going to come back to that preposition. You say, Jerry, you're going to focus on a preposition? Yes, I am. Work with me, friends. Work with me. Okay, so initially embracing this power found in the fellowship has served as the beginning, if not the ongoing basis for many people's understanding of a higher power. So in writing the big book, Bill Wilson went to great pains, though, to use phrases and names to describe a higher power. So for instance, if you ever, and I went through all 164 pages of the big book and looked for all the different names that Bill uses to describe God or higher power. And as you look at this list, God as we understand him, higher power, Father of light, Spirit of the universe, creative intelligence, God consciousness, brotherhood of man, principle, Czar of the heavens, power greater than ourselves, supreme being, nature of the universe, just goes on and on and on. But what he's really doing, in essence, is trying to provide as many ways as possible to name and conceptualize this power greater than ourselves. Bridge of reason. I always thought that one was interesting, too. Think about it as a bridge. So now the question is, how does each of us begin to define our understanding of a higher power? How do we conceptualize the power outside ourselves that will get us clean and sober and keep us that way? So, for many, it starts out with folks start out with traditional images because it's where they go. It's what they've grown up with. They've seen the movies, they've been to TV, some of them have grown up in various houses of worship. And so they use images like, yes, I got Jesus and Buddha and Krishna and Allah, and it seems like I'm forgetting a couple there. But they have traditional images that they work, or some variation of that. It's perfectly good. It's perfectly good understanding of a higher power. Leads you in the direction. If it's keeping you clean and sober, it's perfectly good. But the second place is, you got to remember this sort of human need we have to anthropomorphize our higher power. That means make it like a human being. And the reason for that is primarily we're trying to develop a relationship or an understanding with it, and like, how do I do that except on human terms? So we create pictures in our mind of something which has human characteristics. After all, working to develop this relationship with this power, how do you envision it except in human terms? You know, if you have an understanding that your A or NA group is your higher power, you really think about it in human terms. But you can relate to this higher power regularly by consulting a respected group of members in your home group that you process your issues in recovery with. You could also meditate on an image of a wise committee of these folks and your sponsor gathered to share their experience, strength, and hope with you around the questions that you face. When working with these folks, I can do something I cannot do on my own, which is stay clean and sober, and that's accessing a power greater than myself. Some of the images ascribed to God or higher power just don't work for others. For example, many in American culture refer to God as Father. But if you've grown up with an absent or abusive father, it's difficult to generate much affection for that image. Some women have told me that any male image of a God doesn't work for them since their lives have been negatively impacted by a number of badly behaved men. If you ever try to answer the question about what race or ethnicity God is, that one's going to keep you busy a while. But any conception that the human mind uses to capture the idea of a higher power is only the product of our efforts to relate to it. Like, how do we tie into it? Oh, there are some other ideas too. There's some sort of non-personal things. In the fantasy literature of Star Wars, Obi-Wan challenged us to think about a more generic power called the Force. It's an energy that pervades and surrounds us so we can work with it for good. Some in recovery can conceptualize their higher power similarly, without a defined image or personality which can lead or guide them to good, clean, and sober life. Sometimes it's defined by the needs we bring to the relationship. I remember a young guy I knew several years ago, and I asked him to describe this concept of a higher power to me. He says, well, no, it's really kind of simple. He's about 27 years old. He's got a lot of tattoos. He's got his cigarettes rolled up in his sleeve. And I thought, okay, that's an interesting visual image for a higher power. But I started to think about it, and what I said was that when you think about the needs to the relationship, he was talking about, I want an eminent, a guide, a support, as opposed to something from on high. I want something close by, something like me that I can relate to, that I can be with. So again, it's like, what are the needs you bring to the relationship? And then there's always Jodie Foster. Sorry, everybody knows me well knows I have a crush on Jodie Foster. But the thing with Jodie Foster is this movie called Contact years ago. It's about 20, 25 years old by now. And if you saw that movie, in the movie she's a scientist who goes through a space porthole to another planet and is greeted by an alien on the other side who looks just like her dead father. Now she knows it's not her father. They have a significant conversation that closes with some reference as to why the alien came looking like her dad. And the conclusion becomes obvious. The alien chose the image of her father because it was the most useful image the alien could choose in his mission to engage Jodie and promote trust. The key question for people in 12-step recovery is, what image of a higher power is most useful for me in the business of staying clean and sober? Because clean and sober is what it's all about, friends. If you're not staying clean and sober, you ain't got it. But if you're staying clean and sober, all things are possible. All things. I've seen so many miracles happen over the years. Whatever image is chosen, we need to be clear that it is a product of our human brain's efforts to conceptualize any image, to invest our efforts in the relationship with this power. The other thing I got to get in touch with the fact is, I'm a smart guy. I got 3 college degrees and all that kind of stuff. But I realize that my brain is like way too little to fully conceptualize a higher power that I fully understand. Because even when I talk about like the higher power I experience in an AA group, it's like I don't fully understand what's going on there all the time, but I know that it can have profound effects. I have trust in that power to take care of things, and that's good. Last but not least is some people wrestle with the notion that along the way we can make the mistake of trying to fully understand our higher power. Now, they say, well, I got to understand it before I can invest in it. But for many alcoholics and addicts, working to fully understand something or someone was one of the first steps in our efforts to control it. And the fact is that if we've begun to control it, it isn't higher power anymore. So we need to unmask the fallacy, just really abandon the notion that they've got to fully understand a higher power before we can develop a relationship with it. The understanding of and a relationship with a higher power, like any significant relationship in our lives, is going to change and develop over time. For instance, there was an AA member who wrote an article for the Grapevine. He said, my understanding of a higher power is still subject to shifts. Often I envision it as an indifferent force, something like an electrical current that's available to all living beings, from which human beings can derive strength and generosity and acceptance. but the one thing I feel sure of it is that it's more powerful than my will. It's kind of a key piece. So as I said, your understanding of that will evolve and change as any relationship does over time. So I want to ask a key question now. Everyone want to look at page 5 in your handout? You've got this page that says identifying your higher power. Now, some of you may have very strong ideas about this. Others you may go, nah, not so much, not so clear just yet. Okay, if you're looking at page 5, it starts out with this thing about identifying your higher power. Now, it has this introductory paragraph, but I want to jump right over that because we've talked about a lot of those pieces already, but you're certainly welcome to go back to that. But I'd like you to look at, there's 7 questions on the page there. And what I'd like you to do is focus on question number 3 and question number 5. And just scramble around in your head for a minute on questions 3 and 5. Kind of things, how would you begin to answer that for a close friend, somebody you trust, somebody you'd be willing to talk to? So how would your beliefs about a higher power comfort and support you? How are your interactions with others and life generally different because of your belief in a higher power? You got some thoughts on that? Everybody got some ideas in their head? I want you to chat with somebody sitting near you. Just kind of share your ideas with them, all right? You ready? Go. All right, friends, if we could come back together, please. It is my belief. All right, all y'all, help me out. It is my belief It's my belief that there's at least 2 or 3 people in this room that are feeling brave enough to share some of their thoughts with us, all right? So for instance, when it comes to question number 3, how do your beliefs about a higher power comfort and support you? How would somebody describe that? But did you see that clarity? There are 2 points I really want to make from what she said. Notice how she talked about, I'm not alone. This issue of the complete isolation associated with the depths of addiction. When you're at the bottom, isolation is where we are. And higher power is going to help me move away from that. So I'm glad you identified that piece right away. Other thoughts about how you get comforted, how you get supported by your higher power. Now, things happen for a reason, and I don't have to be thinking about it for my higher power to still be present. Yeah, it's not dependent on me. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than me. Thank you. As you look at number 5, how are your interactions with others and life generally different because of your belief in a higher power? Like what happens? What makes it different? Who's got an idea for me? So again, you're starting to see there's this movement away from isolation and connection to other people. Okay, I want you to see how that theme emerges from a variety of perspectives, that connection to others. Any other thoughts on that? I don't want to belabor to embarrass anybody, but I want to give you chances. Yes. So there's a liberation character to it. I can give up stuff. I can hand it over. Yeah, stuff starts to happen. No, I just want you to see the themes that start to emerge here in this conversation, because you could have a lengthy conversation going through all the questions and kicking them around for a while, but yes. Spiritual experience and spiritual awakening. We can look at the second appendix of the big book. And in that, Bill talks about the terms spiritual experience and spiritual awakening are used many times in this book, which upon careful reading shows that the personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism has manifested itself among us in many different forms. But in other words, when people hear spiritual experience, sometimes they're thinking about the clouds parting and the angels coming down. Okay? They're thinking about that white light experience is sometimes the way people describe it. And there are some people in recovery who have had those kinds of experiences. But the reason Bill wrote the appendix in the second edition was because too many people thought you had to have that or you weren't getting sober. And he said, no, many people, he said, on the other hand, some people had these sudden and spectacular upheavals, but more people than not had the educational variety where they developed slowly over a period of time. And so, but understanding that spiritual experience happens when the personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism has manifested itself. As if somebody staying sober, they are are in the process of spiritual experience, spiritual awakening. Okay? And if you have one of those white light experiences, they're great, but don't feel like it's a necessary or essential thing. So why be spiritually fit? The alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink or drug. Except in a few rare cases, neither he nor any human being can provide such a defense. His defense must come from a higher power. And again, that's Bill talking in the big book. So this notion of the spiritual fitness, we need to define it somehow. Now, I don't know if you thought about physical fitness. I had the opportunity once to be in a physical therapy clinic where there was an Olympic athlete who was working out. Now, if you know anything about serious athletics. This guy, I got tired just watching him because of how hard he worked to get fit, returning from an injury. And so if you think about that level of physical fitness and say, well, what would spiritual fitness look like? And how would I start to get there? You know, we have to understand that alcoholism and addiction are spiritual maladies that require a spiritual solution. So if we're going to be granted a daily reprieve, we have to get spiritually fit. Some years after writing the big book, Bill penned the 12 and 12, and he used the term AA beam as a way to describe spiritual fitness. When describing the 9th step, he says, you know, we first wish to be reasonably certain we are on the AA beam. Notice he's describing that you're being spiritually fit, you're on this beam, you're projecting the appropriate way at life, if you will. You know, later on in the 12th step, he talks about without necessarily taking that first drink, we sometimes get quite far off the beam, which would be unspiritually fit. You know, spiritual fitness or being on the beam is then described as being a state where, you know, we're not fighting it, neither are we avoiding temptation. We feel as though we've been placed in a position of spiritual neutrality, safe and protected. We have not even sworn off. Instead, the problem has been removed. It doesn't exist for us. We're neither cocky nor are we afraid. That is the best sort of single description of being on the beam or being spiritually fit. Just, I'm good. I'm just good where I am. I don't have to be bouncing, you know, off the ceiling, and I don't have to be down. I don't have to be grieving over what I've lost, but I'm just perfectly good with where I am today. So you can achieve spiritual fitness by doing the spiritual acts. Now, I believe everybody in the room here knows what the spiritual acts are. What are the spiritual acts? Okay, work the steps, attending the meetings, service to others, prayer and meditation, working with our sponsors. Is that all of them? Yeah, I've got one more. There we go. And supporting the newcomer. You know, and this is interesting because this is basic stuff. You hear this all the time. You hear it your first day in treatment. Just got to do this stuff. No, this is what we do. This is what we do. This is how you do it. But it's interesting because if I have a sponsee call me up and say, I'm having a really crappy day, I said, are you ready for the quiz? Here's the quiz. How many meetings have you been to this week? Did you pray this morning and last night? You know, have you done any service for anybody else? And the answers are always immediately obvious. And the quiz doesn't change. Over 85 years, the quiz hasn't changed. It's the same stuff. But how quickly we forget, how quickly we get into a place of less than spiritual fitness, how quickly we get off the beam by not doing that stuff on a regular basis. So I knew that it would be pretty obvious stuff for you. You know, Bill makes the point about, he says, the great fact is just this and nothing less. We've had deep and effective spiritual experiences. Remember what she earlier defined as being able to live clean and sober, have revolutionized our whole attitude towards life, our fellows, and God's universe. The central fact of our lives today is the absolute certainty that the Creator's entered our hearts and lives in a way that is indeed miraculous. Commenced to accomplish those things for us we could not do by ourselves. And so, it says, you know, you need to ask yourself but one question. Do you believe, are you even willing to believe that there's something bigger than yourself? As soon as the man or woman can say that they do, or is willing, they're emphatically assured that they're on the way. There are some cautions that Bill asks us to consider, though. He reminds us that we have no monopoly on God, and some of us have got tripped up by spiritual arrogance. When introducing the topic of spiritual practice in the big book, Bill cautions us. He says, you know, discussion of matters medical, psychiatric, social, and religious are by their very nature controversial. He says, occasionally we do encounter people who insist, this is me talking now, not Bill, I want to end quote. Okay, occasionally we do encounter people who insist that they have identified the right or best spiritual path to recovery. But if we're coming from the place that the purpose of a spiritual practice is to create worthwhile lives based on a lifestyle free of alcohol and drugs, then the criteria we use to assess the validity of any particular spiritual practice is simply, is the person pursuing that path living clean and sober life? If the answer is yes, then that person's doing the valid, or if you will, the right path. You know, Bill, reflecting on his own experience, he says, you know, in the first AA years, I all but ruined the whole undertaking. He's talking about the whole of AA. He says, with this sort of unconscious arrogance, God, as I understand him, had to be for everybody. Sometimes my aggression was subtle and sometimes it was crude, but either way it was damaging, perhaps fatally so to a number of non-believers. He says, beyond a higher power, as each of us may envision him, her, they, or it, AA must never, as a society, enter into the field of dogma or theology. We can never become a religion in that sense, lest we kill ourselves by getting bogged down in theological contention. And finally, Bill notes, he says, you know, perhaps one of the more often than we think, We make no contact at depth with alcoholics suffering the dilemma of no faith. As he says, the people who have no religious background at all, he says, if we don't take the time to sort of walk them through these ideas, they don't know what it is they're embracing. People with a religious background at least have something to compare it to or something to build on, depending on their particular take on it. He says, certainly none are more sensitive, talking about people that have no religious background, none are more sensitive to spiritual cocksuredness, pride, and aggression than they are. And I'm sure this is something we too often forget. So Bill was really worried about that. And then he comes forward with this, he writes this in the language of the heart. He says, there was a recent example of the high cost of spiritual pride. A very tough-minded prospect was taken to his first AA meeting, and the first speaker majored on his own drinking problem, and the prospect seemed impressed. The next two speakers each themed their talks on God as I understand him. That could have been good too, but it wasn't. The rubble was their attitude, the way they did present their experience. They did ooze with arrogance. Quite unspoken, yet implicit in everything they said was the same idea. The folks, listen to us. We've got the only true brand of AA, and you'd better get it. The new prospect said he'd had it, and he had. His sponsor protested, no, these guys aren't telling the real A, but it was too late. And last heard from, an early appointment with the undertaker seemed probable. I think it's, but Bill was really clear about, you really have to think about, do we get on a spiritual hilltop and try to present to people that we have the only one way of doing it? We can talk about our experience and how we've done it and invite people to join us on that pathway. Bill went on to explain, he says, in our personal stories, you'll find a wide variation of the way each person out there conceives of the power greater than themselves. Whether we agree with any particular conception doesn't make any difference. These are all questions that individuals need to answer for themselves. But on one proposition, all these men and women agree. Every one of them has gained access to and believes in a power greater than themselves. This power has in each case accomplished the miraculous, the humanly impossible. That means keeping us clean and sober. So when I worked as a spirit detox counselor, I would occasionally encounter clients with strong religious backgrounds who had been active in their community of faith throughout their addiction and who were reluctant to explore 12-step spirituality because it was viewed as a departure from religious orthodoxy. This phenomenon was also discussed in the 12 and 12 by Bill. He says there's skeptical religious people who come to us. He says, now let's take the guy still full of faith but reeking of alcohol. He believes he is devout. His religious observance is scrupulous to clergymen, doctors, friends, and families. This alcoholic means well, tries hard as a heartbreaking riddle. The answer has to do with the quality of his faith rather than his quantity. He may have been doing a whole lot of religious stuff, attending a house of worship, getting active in this and that and the other thing, going to the study groups and that sort of stuff. But the fact was, he really hadn't cleaned house so that the grace of God could enter and expel the obsession. In no deep or meaningful sense had they taken stock of themselves, made amends to those we had harmed, or freely given to any other human being without demand for reward. I'm getting some feedback again. The love of God and man we understand not at all, and therefore we remained self-deceived and so incapable of receiving enough grace to restore to sanity. As he said, it's quite possible for people to be very religious and not be spiritual, and not have encountered a higher power as we understand it in recovery. In an essay referenced earlier by Ernie Kurtz, Bill White, the author, suggests the spirituality that we have witnessed in AA can be summed up in only two words, both prepositions, beyond and between. And I say, wait, you're going to sum up all of spirituality and recovery with two words and the lousy prepositions, beyond and between? He said, yeah, let's talk about the first one. He says, number one, beyond. He says, at its most basic level, spirituality and recovery is about adopting behaviors and attitudes that lift us up and beyond ourselves towards something bigger, a higher power as we understand it. The second preposition is between. Spirituality challenges us to develop transparency and significant connections between ourselves and others who are traveling this path. It's really important to understand that recovery spirituality is not a spirituality of isolation. It's not about me and God in the closet. Essentially the nature of this spirituality and recovery is developing transparency and connections with other people. According to Ernie and Bill White, that we become beyonding and betweening beings. We keep reaching beyond ourselves, and we keep connecting with other people along the way. And when Bill first met with Dr. Bob, he simply told his story, and Dr. Bob expressed a willingness to try what Bill has done. Years later, Bill described that meeting by saying, you see, our talk was a completely mutual thing. I knew that I needed this alcoholic as much as he needed me, and that was it. This mutual give and take is the very heart of all of AA's 12-step work today. So practicing the 11th step. sought through a prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understand Him, praying only for knowledge of His will and the power to carry that out. What might that start to look like? Now, this relationship with a higher power, like any significant relationship in our life, takes time and energy to develop. We need to spend time with God as we understand Him to get to know this entity directly and through others who share a common belief. We need to find out what is valued by your higher power. We need to figure out what makes that relationship work. The major roadblock to any significant relationship for unrecovered alcoholics and addicts is our systemic selfishness and self-centeredness. But as we pursue a relationship with a higher power, we work steps 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. You got that? Chipping away at that selfishness. We go to meetings, work steps, do service work, talk to our sponsors, start to learn how to pray and meditate, and this is something quite different from active addiction. But let's talk about prayer and meditation real specifically now. As the big book points out, we can make some definite and valuable suggestions there. Based on a rich and varied experience in our recovery, what would spirituality in AA look like? Well, prayer is often simply defined as talking to our higher power. But what could that look and sound like? Well, as we have this movement from self-centeredness to selflessness, prayer could begin to change your character over time. So, for instance, an example might be if you have somebody who is sober 3 days, okay? Still detoxing, still not feeling great, and so on and so forth. What might their prayer look like? All right, I was back to the person 3 days sober starting to pray. Oh, God, made a lot of trouble this time. I really need a lot of stuff, okay? So number one, I need to have you get my girlfriend off my back. I need to have you get me a new car because I wrecked the car. And I need a good job to make a lot of money that isn't too hard. Amen. Okay? That's what the prayers look like. Okay? Obviously very self-centered, but we talked about that's exactly where people early in recovery are. They're caught up in everything that's me, that's happening with me, that's happened to me, the me that I can't take care of. Okay? You start to work some steps, you start to get involved in a program, and it takes somebody about 3 months sober. You say, well, what might their prayer look like? And again, the timelines are flexible there, but just think about somebody who's been sober a little while, been working a program, trying to make it happen. And it might look like something like the following. And my sister's been kind of sick lately, so could you kind of heal her up and help her things get better? And I've got this real difficult problem going with my girlfriend now. Can you help me sort that one out? Okay? Now, these are fundamentally good wishes, but they assume two things. Number one is that I know what the bill of a higher power is. And number two is that God needs a to-do list from me. Your higher power does not need a to-do list from you. Okay? So then you get into the stage, perhaps somebody who's been sober 3 years. What does prayer start to look like? Well, it might look like, okay, God, here we are today, and here's what's going on in my life. And this part's working really well. Thank you. I'm grateful for that. This other part over here, I don't have a clue what to do with that. Could you give me some clues, please? And this buddy of mine, this friend over here, he's got a real crap going on in his life right now. I mean, his wife left him. He lost his job and his back went out on him. I thought things were supposed to get better once you got sober. They're getting worse for him. So help me know, is there anything I should do there? Now, do you see how the thing is all about, like, help define my agenda for me? Because it's you're the God and I'm not. It's bigger than me now. And I have a personal experience around these lines that for me was quite startling. I had started to sponsor a guy, and his life went backwards when he got sober. By that I mean he lost his job, his back went out of him, his wife did leave him, he lost the house. I mean, things were just getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And so I'm praying about him. I said, God, I have no clue. What am I supposed to say to this guy? I don't even know how to give him any hope anymore because this is not what sobriety is supposed to look like. And as I'm sitting there at the kitchen table, just kind of praying this through, trying to get this idea, all of a sudden I got a big one-word answer. It's like, boom, screamed into my head. The one-word answer was, Kroger's. What the hell's that all about? I mean, seriously, it was just like, for every reason, I couldn't stop thinking about Kroger's. And all of a sudden I realized, Jerry, the guy's broke. Take his butt to Kroger's and buy him some groceries. That's something I could do. That's something I could make a difference with that day. But it's because I got quiet enough and I got to ask, you know. And to let you know that God can say terribly profound things like Kroger, you know, if you understand it. You talk about it. To me, it's such a wonderful story because it's so, like, right here, right now. Because me, all up in my head, trying to be wonderful and thinking about wonderful things, didn't think about the most basic thing. This big things. Guy needs some groceries. Get him some groceries. I could do that. You know, my balance was okay. I could get by with that week, so that was a good thing. So we're going to think about that prayer evolving over time. So prayer is that conversation that we have with a higher power. You know, and the 12 and 12 Bill talks about those of us who have come to use prayer, you know, wouldn't do without it any more than we do without food, light, or air. Because if the body suffers, so does our minds, our emotions, and our intuitions would lack the vital needed support if we didn't spend some time in prayer and meditation. You know, prayer is communicating our concerns to a power greater than ourselves. Sometimes we pray, a remarkable thing happens. We find the means, the ways, and the energies to perform tasks far beyond our capabilities. That's from the NA Basic Text, which has made some good contributions to this notion of spirituality and recovery too. Now, so prayer can happen so many different ways. I mean, you know, some people, like when I first start sponsoring people, I insist that they put bookends on the day. You start the day with prayer, you finish the day with prayer. I don't care if it's 30 seconds. That's prayer. That's what we do. Okay? Point your mind in a positive direction. But there's memorized prayers, there's individual prayers, it just goes all kinds of ways. There's tons of books and meditation books to work from. But meditation, on the other hand, is often simply defined as listening to our higher power. So how do we become more conscious of our higher power? The NA Basic Text reminds us, in quiet moments of meditation, God's will can become evident to us. Quieting the mind through meditation brings an inner peace and brings us into contact with the God within us. A basic premise of meditation is that it's difficult, if not impossible, to obtain a conscious contact unless your mind is still. The usual never-ending succession of thoughts has to cease for progress to be made. And sometimes we talk about the committee in my head, you know, the million forces arguing for my time and attention. It's like, how do I stop all that noise when I get to meditation? I want to sort of go through a bit of an activity here for now. I'm going to ask you to engage with me for meditation. I know there are several people in the room who have been meditating for years. You know a lot more about it than I do, perhaps. But some of you have perhaps never gotten there, and you sort of see it as, like Bill talks about it, as being the secondhand skill of clergymen that we might get some secondhand benefit from. But I want to walk you through meditation, just an exercise. It'll take about 5 minutes here. And give you some specific thoughts about that. In order to do that, I'm going to ask you to do a couple things. Then I'm going to ask you to sort of adopt what I call the comfortable position, which would be feet flat on the floor, hands comfortably lying in your lap. When we cross our legs and stuff, we tend to restrict little points of circulation and we create little parts of tension that we're not even tuned into. By the way, when I did meditations with the detox crowd, frequently it promoted sleep, which was a good thing, because a lot of times people in detox are having trouble sleeping. You know, so let's let them zone right out. That is not the long run goal of meditation, though. Okay, so if you work with me on this, I'd appreciate it. Just listen carefully. Follow along if you will. In meditation, we're invited to begin by bringing to mind the image of a safe and quiet place. So just gently close your eyes and begin to construct the image of such a place clearly in your mind. Perhaps you've begun to think of a place that has personal meaning for you. Some place you've lived or visited, or one you've seen in a book or movie. Sometimes when I meditate, I think about my grandmother's kitchen, because good things always happened in my grandmother's kitchen. If you're having trouble identifying such a place, you can borrow this one. Begin to see yourself walking along the beach at sunrise. Notice how the sun glistens on the water and begins to warm the air. Feel the cool, wet sand under your feet as you walk along in that space where the waves kiss the shore. Listen carefully as the breeze blows gently through the trees, rustling the leaves. See yourself within this image. Once there, look around carefully and take in the details of your surroundings. This is a place where you can feel safe and comfortable and completely at ease. No harm can possibly come to you in this safe and quiet place. As you settle in, I'd like you to focus on your breathing. Feel your stomach rise and fall as the air moves in and out, slowly and deeply. Begin to experience the sense of calm that can come when resting in a safe and quiet place. If you have any physical tension in any part of your body, just relax the tension. If your shoulders and neck are tight, just let them go. You find yourself clenching your feet, clenching your fists, or tapping your feet. Just let them be at ease and focus once again on the breath. When you're distracted by thoughts or sounds, as we surely will be from time to time, just notice the distraction, but do not attach to it. Think about distractions as if they're dry leaves that can be blown to the side by a gentle breeze, and then gradually return your thoughts to the movement of your breath. Once you've settled into this safe and quiet place, know that your higher power, however you understand that, can be there with you. Invite your higher power into a conversation. Bring to mind something that concerns you today, some problem that needs to be solved, or some challenge you face, and begin to share this concern with your higher power. As you describe your concerns to your higher power, ask for your higher power's guidance and support. Listen carefully to see if your higher power has any ideas to share with you. Whatever the challenge you face, you can begin to view this situation with curiosity and interest, as if it's the very first time you've ever thought about it. You really can choose to not be burdened by all your earlier frustrations or fearful thoughts about the situation, and open yourself up to entirely new thoughts about it. You can begin to see the challenge as something quite manageable when you approach it thoughtfully and break it down into its smaller parts. Once again, if you find your thoughts wandering, gently move your attention back to the breath and eventually to your chosen topic as the gentle breeze dispels the distracting thoughts. Treat yourself kindly and work to avoid self-criticism and judgment. As the conversation draws to a close, bring to mind something for which you are grateful. Perhaps some problem has been solved or some resource found. Maybe you've made a good connection with somebody else in recovery. But whatever it is, express your gratitude to your higher power. As the conversation finishes up, thank your higher power for this time together. Know that your higher power is always ready to meet with you whenever you are willing to step aside and get quiet and seek your higher power's presence. Take another good look around the safe and quiet place. Get this image firmly in your mind, because this place too is always available to you. You need only step back from the day's activities, be quiet for a moment, and seek your higher power's presence. Focus once again on your breathing, feeling the air move in and out slowly and deeply, and be mindful of the deep sense of calm that can come from resting in a safe and quiet place. And this sense of calm is so important for us because we always make better decisions when we're coming from a calm place. When you're ready, we can start to come back together. I want to talk a little bit about the mechanics of meditation. By that I mean sort of the things you want to keep in mind depending on whatever practice you may choose to pursue. First question is sort of the environment. Like when you're first starting out meditation, you sort of need a quiet, undistracting space. Once you've been good at it, the distractions tend to be less important. Your physical position, there's lots of physical positions that are appropriate for meditation. If you're pursuing sleep, laying down is one of them. But seating in a relaxed but alert and unrestricted position is usually most helpful. The breath is deep, slow, and consistent from the diaphragm. Counting sometimes helps focus. Talk about 1 on the inhale, 2 on the exhale, 3 on the inhale, 4 on the exhale. Some people do circular breathing. I breathe in through the nose, out through the mouth. In through the nose, out through the mouth. And just keep that focus going. Talked about sustained or non-judgmental focus. The Buddhist tradition talks about the monkey mind. It says it's almost like our mind has a herd of monkeys in it. The monkeys are jumping around from tree to tree the way our thoughts jump around from place to place. And so how do you get all the monkeys to slow down and point in one direction? And that's actually the mental image I use to calm my mind down, is to see all the monkeys jumping around, and then they all settle down and they all point in the center. And then I'm calm. And I can go there. But other images that people use is like driving down the country road, like there's a white line on the outside and a yellow line in the middle. My job is to keep the car between the lines. Because if I start paying too much attention to what's over here, I put the car in the ditch. If I'm paying attention, I'm hitting another car. But how do I keep myself focused on the task at hand? I often talk about giraffes, not elephants. Now, people who haven't heard this before get a little funny with me, but I want to issue an edict right now. Nobody in the room is allowed to think about elephants. I want you to get all those elephant thoughts out of your mind. How's that working for you? Okay, probably not very well, because the human mind has grave difficulty stopping a thought. If we want to stop a thought, what we have to do is start another thought. So I want you to think about giraffes now. If you ever get a chance to get to the Toledo Zoo, they have this platform where you can go out on the platform to feed the giraffes. And you feed them lettuce leaves. And they're like eyeball to eyeball with the giraffe. It's really neat, you know. And I hand this lettuce leaf to the giraffe. This big black tongue comes out about 14 inches and grabs it. Anybody thinking about elephants? Okay, my point is that don't come to meditation with, I have to stop thinking about this thing I'm obsessing about. Come to meditation with something you want to think about and pursue that path. You'll get there a lot faster. Come up with your image of a safe and quiet place. I mentioned my grandmother's kitchen because that was really a good place for me when I was a kid. But again, think of your own or invent one or find one in a movie and a book. It doesn't make any difference. The idea is when you get there, paint the picture with all of your senses. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you taste? What do you touch? That's what makes it worthwhile. Then there's always the repetitive motions and sounds and words thing. Gandhi, sort of the George Washington of India in terms of their independence from Great Britain, he started a practice of people spinning and weaving their own fabric. Now the reason for this was they grew the cotton in India and then shipped it all off to Great Britain, turned it into fabric, and then shipped it all back to India to sell. And it was against the law for the Indians to actually make fabric. So by way of protest, he says, we're all going to spin our own fabric, make our own stuff. So he'd get the cotton and he would start spinning the yarn and making the fabric, doing the weaving, whatever it was he was doing. And the observation he made was, he says, the busyness of my hands when I'm weaving frees my mind to move heavenward. Okay? People that have been at Sp.A when they do the intervention on Sunday, it's just another version of that. Okay? People talk about running or swimming. And some of you, I don't know if you know what this is. This is Muslim prayer beads. Okay? I have a different name for God for every one of them. This is the Buddhist version. This is my grandmother's rosary. They all went to the same notion, that how do I go through repetitive motions or sounds or words or thoughts to get into that meditative state, to get to that calm state. It's just different cultural and religious expressions, versions of the same thing. Last but not least, we started, finding your own way is another matter. We have to get a basic understanding of what prayer and meditation are. We may not be aware of the many options that are open to us. It's only by being open-minded and taking action that we're likely to find what is right for us as individuals. This is where it works how and why, by the way, is the NA 12 and 12. If we have found that everything feels strange, notice I tried this prayer thing, I can't find anything that feels strange. They don't let you off the hook. They say, no. Then we practice some form of prayer and meditation until it no longer seems unnatural. He says, everything can't be unnatural. Something's going to work for it. Stay with it. Many of us have adopted an eclectic approach, borrowing little practices from here and there, variety of sources, combining those which provide us with the greatest comfort and enlightenment. But Bill cautions us. He says, the spiritual stuff isn't a theory. We got to live it. It's easy to let up on the spiritual program and rest on our laurels, but we're headed for trouble if we do. Alcohol and drugs and all that other stuff is our subtle foes. We are not cured of alcoholism. We really have a daily reprieve contingent on the maintenance of our spiritual condition. Am I going to stay spiritually fit? Am I going to stay on the AA beam? Every day is a day when we must carry the vision of God's will into all our activities. And last but not least, near the end of the big book, not near the end, pardon me, it's on page 55. Bill says, we can only clear the ground a bit. If our testimony helps sweep away prejudice and enables you to think honestly, encourages you to search diligently within yourself, then, if you wish, you can join us on this broad highway. He used that term, broad highway, to describe this spiritual path. With this attitude, you can't fail. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.